Hello, subscribers and viewers of my channel. You are looking at the Kailash Temple in India, and in this video we will figure out who could have built this structure. After watching, you will agree with me that the history of the construction of this temple is completely incorrect, and that this temple was built by a very advanced civilization, us. So what is so special about this temple? The fact is that it was not built by adding stone blocks, like the pyramids in Egypt. A whole mountain was carved to create this temple. There are places around the world where a mountain has been carved from the top to create a structure. The common technique used to build other temples in the past is called embedded monolith. At that time, the Kailash Temple was the only one that used the exact opposite technique, called the carved monolith. To understand why this technique is so different, let's take a look at this column over 30 meters tall. Human beings look something like this compared to this column. Usually it would take years of work to create such a column, to precisely carve it from a huge stone. This column was carved by excavating all the pieces of the mountain around it. And not just this column. This entire temple was once a solid mountain, and from the mountain someone created this. Just imagine what strong stone this temple is made of, if it has stood to this day. By the way, this temple is over 1300 years old. Moreover, scientists say that it was built with primitive tools, meaning people with chisels and hammers carved the solid rock to a depth of 33 meters. The total area of this temple is 1980 square meters. How do they even imagine that? For those who believe this, there's no point in watching further. They also say it was built in less than 18 years. And how did they calculate that, I wonder? Let's calculate it ourselves. Let's do some simple math and see if historians could be right. I am going to assume that people worked every day for 18 years for 12 hours straight, without any breaks. I am going to ignore rainy days, festivals, and wartime, and assume that people worked continuously like robots. I will also ignore the time spent on complex engineering design and planning. We'll just focus on the removal of stone. If 400,000 tons of rock were removed in 18 years, then 22,222 tons of rock needed to be removed each year. This means that 60 tons of rock were removed each day. This means that 5 tons of rock were removed each hour. I think we can all agree that even today, it is impossible to remove 5 tons of rock from a mountain every hour, even with all our technology. So if this is impossible from a human perspective, was it even done by people? So, then they had technologies many times better than ours. And now forget about creating such an extraordinary structure and let's ask a question. Can human beings at least destroy this temple? In fact, the Muslim king Arandit hired thousands of workers to completely demolish this temple. In 1682, he ordered the temple to be destroyed so that not a trace of it would remain. Records show that 1,000 people worked for 3 years, were able to cause very minimal damage, to break and mutilate a few statues here and there, but they realized that completely destroying this temple was simply impossible. Aurangzeb finally gave up on this unachievable task. Note that this attempt at destruction is very similar to another mysterious structure, called the Pyramid of Mykerinos in Egypt, smallest in size of all the pyramids. Another Muslim ruler wanted all the pyramids to be destroyed, and began his work specifically with this pyramid. After many years of attempts, he managed to make only a small dent in the pyramid. He also gave up. Were all these structures indestructible? That's why people are unable to destroy them around the world, created by a past civilization. In fact, some archaeologists agree that the Kailash Temple was created before any other temple in the Ellora cave complex. It impresses with its architecture, design, and size, which surpass those of other nearby temples. This may be explained by the fact that the temple was created by some other beings or forces possessing incredible skills. However, if we assume that the temple was built by humans, it is logical to suppose that over time, the technologies for processing rocks and design would improve, and people would acquire more knowledge. This would allow them to create even more amazing structures in the future. Despite this, the Kailash Temple remains the oldest and most majestic. So let's assume that humans were the source of creating such a magnificent structure as the Kailash Temple. This raises an interesting thought. How could humans achieve such a level of mastery and engineering excellence to create something so unique? One possible interpretation is that at some point in history, humans possessed knowledge and techniques that surpassed those we have now. Perhaps for some reasons this knowledge was lost and forgotten over time. It is possible that some catastrophe occurred after the construction of the Kailash Temple, or other circumstances that led to the loss of technological progress and skills necessary to create such structures. I cannot believe that this could be created with primitive tools. Unlike other temples, Kailash is the only one that is visible from the air. Among the 34 ancient temples of India carved side by side, Kailash stands out distinctly, and you can see it during a flight. Is it just a coincidence? Or was it created so that those who built it could see it from the air? Even in Google Earth, the temple is very clearly visible. At the top of the Kailash Temple, there is a cross that can be seen from above. This cross is formed by a platform on which 4 lions are located. An interesting question arises. Is it possible that this unique structure was created as a signal for those in the air? Although the exact intentions of the creators of the Kailash Temple remain a mystery, we can suggest several possible explanations. One of them is that the image of the cross and lions from above could have symbolic meaning for those traveling in the air. Perhaps it was a kind of landmark or signal indicating the presence of a sacred place or embodying the spiritual significance of the temple. But one thing I can say for sure, this temple was very carefully thought out. Everything had to be planned with an accuracy of 1% before they started carving the mountain. For example, you cannot carve these 2 structures separately and then decide to build this bridge later. No connecting or external stones were used here at all. Everything was perfectly carved from solid rock. Just imagine, one tiny mistake and everything goes to waste. There are no mistakes here, and they built it as planned. So do you still believe that this was done with picks, chisels, and hammers by people with limited mathematical and architectural knowledge? The Kailash Temple was built by a great advanced civilization, regardless of where it originated, on Earth or somewhere else. There is something very strange about these columns. If you look closer, you can see tiny round marks around the column. They are formed as a result of mechanical processing of the column on a lathe. This process is called turning. This cannot be achieved by hand with chisels and hammers. If you look at these columns, it will be clear that they were made using machines. In fact, archaeologists agree that these columns were made using lathes, but they do not provide an explanation for how these columns were processed 900 years ago. Nowadays, we can create these grooves and patterns on a lathe, but processing a stone pillar 12 cubits high would be a very challenging task even today. So how were these columns created? To the astonishing perfection of ancient times. Did ancient builders use machine tools in the same way we use them today? If so, is it possible that they carved these machine tools right in this temple? Here you can see a very strange device in the hands of a god named Masana Bhairava. It clearly represents a type of chisel. The mechanism called planetary gears. The outer gear has 32 teeth, while the inner gear has exactly half that number, namely 16 teeth. This is how we use reducers today. If this were just an imaginary tool, how could ancient sculptors come up with such a gear ratio of 2:1? What else is interesting here? We can also see a clasp that wraps around this mechanism and is fixed in the center. Today we use exactly the same technology. We use something called a locking ring to keep these mechanisms in place. If historians are correct, how could primitive people, working with chisels and hammers, conceive such a complex mechanism? Is it possible that advanced mechanical processing technology was used 900 years ago? Isn't that why we see such perfect columns? What is even more interesting here is that Masana Bhairava means the god of measurement. Is it just a coincidence that the god of measurement holds an advanced tool in his hands? But the most interesting evidence of mechanical processing is not outside the temple, so let's delve into the deep dark chambers of the temple. And let's see if we can find any more evidence. Before you is a god standing 7 feet tall, adorned with the most terrifying decorations. His crown is adorned with skulls less than 1 inch wide, and you can pass a small twig through one eye and it will come out through the ear on the other side. The twig can also be passed from ear to ear as well as from ear to mouth in any way that is convenient for you. This means that the entire skull is hollow inside. It is impossible to extract the interior of a small sphere that is only 1 inch wide. Even with modern machines, it would be very difficult. We know for sure that creating a hollow sphere inside such a small stone is impossible with primitive tools. It is possible that the small skulls, crowns, and other fragments were carved from other stones and then glued together. No, archaeologists confirm that this figure, 7 feet tall, is made from a solid stone. How can we explain these sculptures made 900 years ago? Even the small patterns in this temple are simply incredible. Here are some threads carved from stone. You can stick your finger through one end and they will go through the other. Hoysaleswara is famous for having the 6th and 7th largest bulls in India. However, in terms of beauty, they take first and second place. This is because they look as if they were created with high precision in mechanical processing. For example, look at the level of polishing. You can literally see your face as in a mirror, and this is after 900 years of corrosion and damage, so you can only imagine how perfect they looked at the time when they were first created. Today, for such a level of polishing, we use tools like a rotary burr. If you look at modern drilling and polishing tools, you'll see that they look like this. Similar tools used in ancient times. And what is even more important, these tools are also depicted in the carvings in the temple. Here we see a tool that looks almost identical to the rotary tool in the hands of the deity. And here is another person holding another tool. That the device looks the same. But they are identical. Their combs are different. The drilling and polishing tools we use today have different combs for different types of mechanical processing. Around the world, we see gods holding this mysterious tool, which are perceived as pine cones. These really pine cones? Is it possible that the gods in this Indian temple are holding pine cones instead of tools? But pine trees do not grow in India and have never grown. How could the ancient builders have seen pine cones 900 years ago? But we are not done yet. Inside the temple, there are columns like these. When you see such columns, you immediately realize that doing this without certain technologies is simply impossible. On this column, we see structures resembling gears, and these columns are much more complex than ordinary smooth columns. We are capable of making such columns, but only using CNC machines that are capable of milling, cutting, etc. Archaeologists agree that these pillars can only be made using lathe processing. At the same time, they confirm that these pillars are over 800 years old. Now we will not try to understand how they were made. We will consider the question why. Why make such complex pillars? Maybe they are not pillars at all. By definition, a pillar is a supporting structure for a building. But are the pillars in ancient temples of India such? One of the researchers, whose reference I will leave in the description, believes that they were made for a different purpose. Let's examine 4 pillars, or rather the ring-shaped structures at the top. A person who knows how a gearbox works in our modern cars will immediately understand this mechanism. The ring on the first pillar has 8 sides, the ring on the second has 16, on the 1/3 32, and on the fourth 64. These are not rings, but gears with a gear ratio. Is this a coincidence? Or were they specifically created with such a specific ratio? Hardly. In some temples there are similar rings, and they can rotate there. However, some of the rings have been filled with cement to prevent tourists from rotating them. In this case, archaeologists concluded that these pillars were not made from a single stone. Each gear is made from a separate stone that can rotate, and if they are connected by a belt, each gear will rotate at a different speed. That is why they have such a ratio. Technology is also used in various modern machines. But did ancient builders use these columns? Like we do on a bicycle? Interestingly, in the same temple, there is a statue holding a chain. Moreover, it is not just similar, it is identical to a modern chain. And it is the same age as these columns, Egyptian pyramids. What and why did the ancient Egyptians build such structures for? There's an opinion that the entire world history, as presented by textbooks, is a deception. There are several assumptions and theories put forward by scientists that are supposedly already proven. According to official history, the ancient Egyptians built the first pyramid in 2800 BC, almost 5,000 years ago, 100 BC, almost 5,000 years ago. And now imagine such a situation. The lost mammoths have only recently gone extinct. No states had been formed. People had no idea about the exact sciences such as medicine, engineering, chemistry, mathematics, physics, and so on. The only thing humanity of that time knew how to do was make copper tools and some types of fabrics and decorations. This was not even heard of back then. According to the so-called scientists, we were still hanging on trees and using sticks to drive away predators, and at that time, structures were being built in Egypt that no one can replicate to this day. In today's time, attempts have been made to reproduce a scaled-down version of the construction. Scientists from Japan had no success, even using modern measuring instruments. They were unable to get from the first row of blocks to the top in such a way that a perfect cone was formed. 1 centimeter of error in the lower rows of stones resulted in a deviation of several meters at the top. And this was despite the fact that they were building a tiny pyramid only about 12 meters tall. And how can a normal person believe that something like this was built at the dawn of modern human development? Before putting forward any theories, at least one historian tried to manually move at least one 3-ton block. Just imagine the scale of the structures, as there are not 3 pyramids in Egypt, but more than 100. Only 3 of them are the most impressive. If you have never seen them in person, close your eyes and imagine a giant nearly 150 meters tall, with each side measuring 230 meters. 2,500,000 stone blocks are laid in such a way that the margin of error is just a few centimeters. How did they do it? Who was the first to say that the pyramids have any relation to the Egyptians? It's because they stood on their territory. And because mummified deceased pharaohs were found there, the overwhelming majority of mummified remains found in Egypt were in sarcophagi, placed in small rooms where a modern person cannot stand upright, while in the case of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, it is a colossal structure, all of it for one small sarcophagus. Maybe the Egyptians simply brought their pharaoh's body there, and the structure existed before Egypt even came into being. Also, there is not a single hieroglyph in the Great Pyramid of Khufu indicating this pharaoh. Strange, isn't it? Although no, there is one hieroglyph after all. It was made in the 19th century to show to tourists. They're just messing with our heads. Someone's sick mind decided that half-naked savages in the desert, without knowledge of engineering, architecture, and mathematics, could build such machines. If the Egyptians were able to build such things back then at the very least they should be the masters of the land now. However, it's the opposite, and Egypt is a developing country. In the painting by Herodotus, dated 150 BC, there is allegedly a scene of construction. But did Herodotus paint this, or is it another attempt to confuse us? Painting has been well preserved for 2,500 years. Iron doesn't last that long, yet the drawing is just fine, and all in the finest details. If we examine the painting more closely, it turns out that 5,000 years ago, people knew what a lever was, which Archimedes would discover millennia later. The question arises, why didn't the Egyptians preserve this knowledge for their descendants? It turns out that the Egyptians dressed like Europeans. Seems there was no point in depicting the lifting of large stone blocks. Let's show the lifting of small stones. And everything else was done according to that principle. Historians faced a very difficult task, to instill in our minds the idea of how people built the pyramids and worked stone with copper tools. And then it began. It turns out that the Egyptians built a mound. They used this mound to hold the blocks to the top. To create a mound that allows rolling a block 150 meters to the top, it must be several kilometers long. There simply isn't enough sand in the desert for such a mound. Wheels had not yet been invented at that time, and according to scientists, the blocks, each weighing 2.5 tons, were dragged by sledges, while obelisks weighing 1,200 tons lie in the quarry, which were never erected. Can you imagine what 1,200 tons is? It's about 1,000 passenger cars. It's an entire train. What kind of force must have been required to lift this obelisk? What happened? Did the Egyptians stop building pyramids? Did they run out of people? Or perhaps they ran out of knowledge, have been taught that the pyramids are tombs for pharaohs. There is a chamber for the king and queen, etc. Has anyone else in history built a tomb taller than all other structures for the next 44 centuries? Who among people ever built a grave, tomb, mausoleum, or crypt, perfectly aligning the structure to the north of the earth? For what purpose? Someone built a tomb with a complex system of rooms, of unknown purpose, having strange angles of inclination, consistent throughout. Has anyone ever made a grave where the internal rooms mathematically combined with the overall height? The height of the Pyramid of Khufu divided by 2 gives the apex of the middle chamber if divided by 2. At 3, the ceiling of the upper chamber. At 4, the top of the middle room. At 5, the floor of the lower chamber. And at 7, the floor of the middle chamber. Did anyone in the tomb use the number P and the Fibonacci number? It seems that the answer is obvious. But the global archaeological community has blindly asserted for many years that the pyramids of Cheops are tombs, that all numerical phenomena are coincidences, and that there is nothing special about them, that its complex structure and precision are random. I have a rather unpopular theory, that the Egyptians lived among the pyramids for thousands of years, were abandoned and no longer needed, and only Cheops thought of making one such pyramid his tomb. Naturally, he chose the largest one, and of course, it would be worth noting the location of the pyramids. This includes orientation to the cardinal points, orientation to the constellation Orion, perfect proportions, and the monstrous weight of the building stones. Don't you think that for 5,000 years ago, this is really excessive? Around the world, according to historians, people built wooden palisades and earth huts, ate grass, and wrapped themselves in hides. And the Egyptians were so smart that they created construction masterpieces that are still impossible to replicate without modern equipment.